The winter of 1945 found Nazi Germany teetering on the edge of collapse. The failure of the Ardennes offensive, launched in December 1944, had not only drained the Wehrmacht of its last reserves in the West, but had also exposed the Reich to a dual catastrophe: relentless Allied advances from the West, and an overwhelming Soviet juggernaut driving from the East. By late January, the Red Army had launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, sweeping through Poland, crossing the Oder River, and approaching within striking distance of Berlin. In Hungary, German forces had been pushed back toward the Austrian border, while to the north, Soviet spearheads threatened to sever East Prussia from the rest of Germany entirely. It was within this climate of desperation that Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, sought to mount one last counterstroke, a bold attempt to wrest back the initiative on the Eastern Front and stabilize the crumbling lines before Germany itself was overrun. The geopolitical context of this effort was defined by Germany's growing isolation. Allied bombing had gutted industrial output, fuel reserves were critically low, and much of the Wehrmacht's experienced officer corps had been lost in years of attrition. Hitler's belief in the potential of a decisive counteroffensive, however, remained unshaken. The Nazi leadership viewed the Red Army's rapid advance not as a sign of inevitable defeat, but as an opportunity. If their spearheads could be severed or encircled, perhaps the Soviets could be delayed long enough for Germany to regroup, or for the Western Allies to reconsider their post-war ambitions and negotiate. The chosen theater for this gambit was the Hungarian plain, where vital oil fields at Nagy Kanisa and the approaches to Vienna could provide both economic and strategic reprieve if secured. German military preparedness for such a venture, however, was deeply flawed. The Wehrmacht in early 1945 was a shadow of its former self, dependent on poorly trained replacements, understrength divisions, and dwindling supplies of armor and fuel. Yet, Hitler remained convinced that concentrated use of Germany's last operational armored formations, the remnants of elite panzer divisions, including the 6th SS Panzer Army, could deliver a decisive blow. Intelligence assessments within the OKW noted that the Red Army, having advanced at breakneck speed, was vulnerable to counterattack due to extended supply lines and dispersed formations in Hungary. Public sentiment in Germany was divided. While propaganda promised salvation through miracle offensives, most civilians, already enduring mass evacuations, shortages, and relentless bombing, understood that the war had entered its terminal phase. In this context, Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, took shape, the last major German offensive of the Second World War. Designed to strike Soviet forces along the western shore of Lake Balaton and secure the oil-rich region of western Hungary, the operation aimed not merely to protect Germany's dwindling energy reserves, but to cripple the Red Army's ability to sustain its push toward Vienna and Berlin. For Hitler, it represented more than a military maneuver. It was a symbolic statement that the Reich could still dictate the tempo of war, even in its death throes. For the Red Army, though not yet aware of the scale of the coming attack, the German buildup signaled that the final defeat of Germany would not come without another fierce and costly clash. Before dawn on the 6th of March 1945, German forces launched their final large-scale offensive of the war, striking Soviet positions along the western and southern shores of Lake Balaton in Hungary. The operation, codenamed Frühlingserwachen, opened with a concentrated armored thrust led by the 6th SS Panzer Army, supported by elements of the 6th and 3rd Panzer Armies and Luftwaffe ground divisions. The attack aimed to split and encircle Soviet formations, seize the vital oil fields near Nagy Kanisa, and push eastward to disrupt the Red Army's logistics before they could mount their anticipated spring offensive toward Vienna and Austria. Despite the depleted state of the Wehrmacht, the opening blows were delivered with a level of coordination and intensity that briefly recalled earlier years of German offensive capability. The initial German advance was aided by favorable conditions in the first hours. The Red Army, spread thin to cover a broad front and still adjusting supply lines after their rapid winter gains, was caught off guard by the scale of the assault. Several Soviet forward positions were overrun, as German Tiger II and Panther tanks spearheaded the attack. Supported by concentrated artillery barrages and low-level Luftwaffe sorties, The 6th SS Panzer Army, despite fuel shortages, managed to penetrate several kilometers into Soviet-held territory on the first day, driving back rifle divisions and threatening to outflank Red Army units near Sekis Fair Var. Reports from the front suggested momentary disarray among Soviet field commanders, some of whom underestimated the scale of the German effort, believing it to be a limited spoiling attack rather than a full-scale counteroffensive. The command structures on both sides were quickly tested. On the German side, General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, faced the challenge of coordinating an offensive with units already worn down from months of fighting and operating on minimal fuel reserves. Orders from Hitler emphasized rapid, decisive thrusts toward the oil fields in Vienna, forbidding any significant withdrawals or pauses, even as logistical difficulties mounted. On the Soviet side, Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin of the 3rd Ukrainian Front rapidly began consolidating reserves, rushing mechanized and artillery units to threaten sectors to blunt the German advance. Soviet commanders quickly realized that the offensive, though bold, was concentrated and heavily reliant on armored breakthroughs. This understanding informed their immediate shift toward layered defenses and counter-concentration of anti-tank assets. The reaction from higher commands underscored the stakes. In Berlin, Hitler viewed the early gains as proof that the Reich could still seize the initiative, issuing messages lauding the resurgence of German arms and demanding that the offensive be driven without respite toward its objectives. In Moscow, Stalin and the Stavka monitored developments closely, confident that their numerical and logistical superiority would ultimately prevail, but unwilling to underestimate a desperate foe capable of inflicting temporary setbacks. Orders were given to ensure that Soviet countermeasures were swift and decisive, even if it meant pulling formations from other sectors. By the end of 6th March, the opening phase of the counterattack had yielded localized gains for the Germans. Several villages and strategic positions along the southern approaches to Lake Balaton had been seized, and Soviet frontline units were compelled to retreat to secondary defensive lines. However, the cost was already evident. Fuel shortages forced some panzer battalions to abandon vehicles, artillery ammunition was expended at unsustainable rates, and casualties among infantry and armored crews were mounting. The offensive had begun with a surge of momentum, but the fragile foundations of Germany's last counterstrike were already showing signs of strain, even as its commanders pressed forward in hopes of achieving a breakthrough before Soviet reserves could fully respond. The strategic conception of Operation Frühlingserwachen was driven less by realistic military calculations than by Hitler's belief that a dramatic counterstroke could still reshape the war's trajectory. The offensive's objectives reflected a mixture of tactical necessity and political desperation. At its core, the plan aimed to secure Hungary's Nagy Kanizsa oil fields, one of the last remaining sources of fuel for the Reich, while simultaneously pushing back the 3rd Ukrainian Front to delay the Red Army's advance into Austria and protect Vienna. Hitler viewed the retention of these oil reserves as vital, not only for sustaining the Wehrmacht, but also for maintaining the illusion that Germany could still field mobile, mechanized forces capable of resisting the Allies on multiple fronts. If the Soviets could be thrown off balance and their timetable delayed, the Nazi leadership believed there might be room to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, exploiting tensions between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The German plan hinged on the striking power of the 6th SS Panzer Army, composed of elite but depleted formations, including remnants of the Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend divisions. These units, bloodied in the Ardennes just weeks earlier, were redeployed to Hungary despite their losses, tasked with spearheading deep penetrations into Soviet lines. Supporting them were the 6th Army and 3rd Panzer Army, whose roles were to hold flanks and exploit any breakthroughs. Logistics, however, posed a nearly insurmountable challenge. Fuel shortages forced rationing, to the point that some armored units had to pool resources simply to move into their starting positions. Artillery and ammunition stockpiles were insufficient for prolonged bombardments, forcing reliance on concentrated short-duration barrages rather than sustained support. Luftwaffe assets were minimal, with only a fraction of available aircraft committed due to fuel scarcity and the Allies' dominance over much of Europe's skies. On the Soviet side, strategic assessments had anticipated a potential German counterattack, though the scale and timing of Frühlingserwachen were initially underestimated. The Stavka's primary objectives in early 1945 were the capture of Vienna and the securing of Hungary as a launch pad for advances into Czechoslovakia and southern Germany. Marshal Tolbukin's Third Ukrainian Front and Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front fielded a combined force of over 6,000 troops, supported by hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and a robust logistical network that had been expanding steadily since the autumn of 1944. While Soviet forces were stretched after their winter offensives, they maintained significant reserves, including tank corps and guards armies, which could be redeployed rapidly once the nature of the German attack became clear. The Red Army's doctrine emphasized elastic defense, absorbing the initial shock, stabilizing the front, and then counterattacking with superior numbers and firepower to crush the attacking force. Propaganda played a notable role in shaping the perception of the operation. German state media hailed Frühlingserwachen as proof that the Reich was still capable of decisive action, portraying the offensive as a strike that would drive the Bolsheviks from Hungary and secure the Reich's future. Newsreels emphasized the presence of the Waffen-SS and elite panzer formations, evoking images of earlier German triumphs to bolster civilian morale and rally wavering troops. Inside Germany, such portrayals offered fleeting hope, though many civilians, watching the devastation wrought by Allied bombers and the steady retreat of their armies, viewed such claims with skepticism. Soviet propaganda, by contrast, framed the German counterattack as the last gasp of a defeated enemy. While acknowledging the intensity of the fighting, Soviet media emphasized the Red Army's ability to absorb and repel the assault, reassuring soldiers and civilians alike that victory remained inevitable despite temporary setbacks. In practice, the preparations for Frühlingserwachen revealed the contradictions of Germany's strategic situation. While the offensive aimed to demonstrate renewed German strength, it exposed the hollow reality of the Wehrmacht's condition: overextended supply lines, a shortage of trained replacements, and an increasing reliance on hastily mobilized or under-equipped formations. Even before the first shots were fired, the operation's prospects for sustained success were limited by the imbalance between its ambitious goals and the dwindling means available to achieve them. The Red Army, though momentarily surprised, retained the depth, manpower, and material advantage to counter any German thrust, raising questions within even the German high command about whether this final gamble could achieve more than a temporary delay in the Reich's inevitable defeat. The German counterattack erupted into full-scale combat along the shores of Lake Balaton and the surrounding Hungarian countryside, quickly revealing the severity of the challenges both armies faced. On 7 and 8 March 1945, the spearheads of the 6th SS Panzer Army drove deeper into Soviet lines, capturing several villages and pushing forward towards Székesfehérvár. Panther and Tiger, the two tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, managed to achieve local breakthroughs, forcing Soviet rifle divisions to fall back and abandoning several forward defensive positions. For the first time since the Ardennes, German armored formations appeared to regain some of their old momentum, their concentrated thrusts momentarily unsettling Soviet field commanders. Yet these gains came at a steep price and were more tenuous than they first appeared. The spring thaw had turned roads and fields into a morass, bogging down heavy tanks and vehicles and forcing convoys onto narrow, overburdened routes that became easy targets for Soviet artillery and airstrikes. Many of the Waffen-SS divisions, still rebuilding from losses suffered in Belgium, were operating with reduced strength, some at only 50% of their authorized personnel and equipment. Mechanical failures plagued the heavier tanks, especially the Tiger IIs, which struggled on the muddy terrain and consumed scarce fuel at unsustainable rates. Several battalions were forced to halt, not by enemy fire, but because their fuel convoys could not keep pace or had been destroyed by Soviet aircraft. For Soviet troops, the sudden German surge triggered a rapid, coordinated response. Marshal Tolbukin ordered immediate countermeasures, pulling tank brigades and guards rifle units from reserve to stabilize the threatened sectors. Soviet artillery, positioned in depth, began saturating the advancing German columns, targeting bridges, crossroads, and likely assembly points. The 17th Air Army launched waves of ground attack missions, hunting German armor and disrupting supply lines, while reconnaissance units scouted for the best positions to blunt the panzer thrusts. Despite the shock of the offensive, Soviet morale remained firm. Years of relentless combat had hardened the Red Army into a force accustomed to absorbing such blows before counterstriking. The civilian population in the Hungarian countryside bore the brunt of the battle's early stages. Villages caught in the fighting were shelled and burned, with inhabitants forced to flee on foot or by cart, often alongside retreating Soviet or advancing German units. Hungarian civilians, many already displaced by previous campaigns, faced violence and requisition from both sides, with supplies stripped by German formations desperate to sustain their momentum and Soviet units preparing to fortify new defensive lines. The constant movement of armies, combined with heavy bombardments, left entire swaths of farmland unrecognizable, transforming the area into a desolate battlefield where survival often depended on evading both armies altogether. Unexpected tactical outcomes began to shape the engagement. German armored columns, while initially effective, found their flanks exposed as Soviet units, using flexible defensive tactics, staged local counterattacks, and ambushes along wooded routes and minor roads. Several German spearheads became bogged down when Soviet sappers destroyed bridges or flooded lowlands, halting their advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Germans also struggled to coordinate between their elite panzer divisions and the more static infantry and Luftwaffe ground units tasked with holding the flanks. Gaps developed, and while some were closed through hasty redeployment, others allowed Soviet reconnaissance and forward detachments to harass supply convoys, further straining German efforts. By 9th of March, the first phase of engagements had produced mixed results. The Germans had advanced several kilometers, recapturing limited territory and forcing the Red Army onto the defensive in some areas. But they had failed to achieve any deep penetration or encirclement. The offensive was beginning to slow under the combined weight of logistical shortfalls, stubborn Soviet resistance, and the realities of terrain and weather. While Hitler hailed the early territorial gains as proof of the operation's potential success, commanders on the ground, including Sepp Dietrich, recognized that sustaining momentum would require more resources and coordination than the Wehrmacht still possessed. The Red Army, now fully aware of the scope of the attack, prepared to shift from containment to counteroffensive, setting the stage for a brutal escalation that would determine the fate of Germany's last significant gamble on the Eastern Front. As the counterattack pressed into its second week, from 10 to 13 March 1945, the fighting around Lake Balaton escalated into a grinding confrontation that drained German strength faster than it inflicted damage on the Soviets. The 6th SS Panzer Army, still the offensive central striking force, continued to push against Tolbuchen's 3rd Ukrainian Front, but every kilometer gained came at immense cost. The initial momentum of the assault was eroding as fuel shortages became critical. Many armored battalions could not advance beyond their starting positions without diverting fuel from supply depots or immobilizing other vehicles. This forced commanders to limit their thrusts to narrow corridors, which Soviet artillery and aircraft quickly targeted. The muddy terrain, worsened by continued thaw and heavy use, slowed even the most determined panzer thrusts, and created traffic jams that left convoys vulnerable to attack. German command structures began to fray under the strain of Hitler's rigid orders and the realities of the battlefield. Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, repeatedly requested permission to consolidate positions and redeploy exhausted units, but Hitler insisted that the offensive continue at full intensity. This inflexibility led to poorly coordinated attacks, as understrength divisions were thrown forward without adequate reconnaissance or artillery support, often into well-prepared Soviet kill zones. The 6th Army and 3rd Panzer Army, intended to stabilize the flanks and exploit breakthroughs, were themselves forced onto the defensive as Soviet counterattacks threatened their positions, sapping their ability to support the panzer thrusts. The resulting fragmentation undermined the cohesion of the entire operation, leaving advancing spearheads increasingly isolated. On the Soviet side, the scale of the German attack had now become clear, and Tolbukin coordinated with Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front to stabilize the front through a layered defense in depth. Soviet anti-tank units, including dug-in 76 mm and 85 mm guns, were concentrated along likely avenues of German advance, while minefields and obstacles were deployed to slow heavy armor. Artillery batteries unleashed rolling barrages ahead of German assaults, while the 17th and 5th Air Armies launched near-constant sorties against fuel depots, roads, and exposed panzer formations. Soviet reserves, including Guards tank and mechanized corps, were shifted to threatened sectors, prepared to launch counteroffensives once the German momentum faltered. Despite the ferocity of the fighting, Soviet command maintained flexibility, avoiding large-scale, static engagements that might allow German armor to achieve local superiority. The human toll on both sides intensified during this period. German infantry, often ill-equipped and lacking adequate winter clothing, endured constant bombardment and close-quarter combat as they tried to hold captured villages and road junctions. Volkssturm detachments and Luftwaffe ground troops, lacking combat experience, suffered disproportionately, frequently collapsing under Soviet pressure or abandoning positions when encirclement threatened. Soviet units, while better supplied, also paid heavily. Many rifle divisions bore the brunt of German counterattacks, sustaining high casualty rates as they absorbed and blunted the panzer assaults. For both armies, medical facilities were overwhelmed, with field hospitals operating beyond capacity and evacuation routes frequently disrupted by airstrikes and artillery fire. Civilians in the region faced devastation as the fighting dragged on. Hungarian villages near Lake Balaton became battlegrounds, their populations driven out or caught in the crossfire. Soviet requisition teams and German foraging parties stripped the countryside of food and livestock, while partisan activity added another layer of instability as small groups attacked supply lines and communications for both sides. Refugees moved in every direction, some fleeing west with retreating German units, others seeking shelter deeper within Soviet-controlled territory, only to face looting or forced labor. The front, fluid and violent, left little safe haven for anyone caught between the clashing armies. By mid-March, the German offensive was visibly faltering, though still holding pockets of contested territory and inflicting steady casualties on the Red Army. The pace of the advance slowed to a crawl. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted, artillery shells were rationed, and the Luftwaffe could no longer provide consistent air cover due to Allied bombing of forward airfields. Soviet counterattacks grew bolder, striking at the flanks and supply routes of the Panzer spearheads, forcing the Germans to divert their dwindling reserves to defensive actions rather than forward thrusts. The operation, conceived as a decisive strike to secure Hungary and delay the Soviet drive into Austria, was becoming a costly static struggle that bled away the last strength of Germany's armored elite. Between 14 and 17th of March 1945, Operation Frühlingserwachen reached its most intense and decisive phase. The German High Command, despite the growing logistical collapse and mounting casualties, continued to push the 6th SS Panzer Army forward in a final bid to achieve a breakthrough before the Red Army could mount a coordinated counterstroke. Hitler demanded that Sepp Dietrich and his panzer divisions press on toward the Nagy-Kaneza oil fields and beyond, even as their spearheads stalled along a front riddled with mud, destroyed infrastructure, and deepening Soviet resistance. To maintain pressure, Dietrich was forced to commit his last operational reserves, including understrength Panzer Grenadier regiments and remaining heavy tanks, into piecemeal assaults that lacked the mass and momentum originally envisioned for the operation. The Red Army, by this stage, had fully stabilized its lines and was preparing for a counteroffensive. Tolbukin's Third Ukrainian Front, now reinforced with additional tank corps and guards formations, had completed the construction of defensive belts designed to channel German attacks into kill zones, where artillery and anti-tank guns could deliver maximum effect. The Soviets, familiar with the limitations of German fuel supplies, targeted supply depots and convoys relentlessly, forcing many panzer units to halt for lack of resources. In the air, Soviet aircraft gained near total dominance, as the Luftwaffe's dwindling fuel stocks and Allied pressure on air bases left few German planes able to support the offensive. Sturmovik ground attack squadrons roamed freely, strafing stalled armor and disrupting communications, while Soviet artillery, massed in depth, subjected German forward positions to constant bombardment. The human cost escalated sharply during these peak days of combat. German armored units, often fighting with barely functional logistics, were thrown into repeated assaults on Soviet strongpoints, suffering catastrophic losses. Entire panzer companies were immobilized due to lack of fuel, abandoned and destroyed to prevent capture as the lines shifted. Infantry, many drawn from Luftwaffe field divisions and Volkssturm units with minimal combat experience, bore the brunt of holding the flanks and rear positions, often collapsing under concentrated Soviet counterattacks. Soviet rifle divisions, though benefiting from superior supply and artillery support, also endured heavy losses as they absorbed and repelled German assaults. Trenches and villages became charnel grounds, with both sides trading control multiple times in a single day as the battle devolved into attritional warfare. High command decisions during this stage revealed the widening gulf between Hitler's directives and operational realities. Despite reports from Dietrich and other field commanders warning that their forces were exhausted and facing destruction, Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal or even a pause to regroup. His belief that holding the Nagakaniza oil region was essential for the Reich's survival blinded him to the operational futility of the offensive. Orders from Berlin demanded continued attacks, even when fuel supplies could no longer sustain mechanized movement, leading to scenes of heavy tanks sitting immobile in the mud, while crews attempted to defend them as static fortifications. On the Soviet side, Tolbukin, confident in his reserves and logistical superiority, began shifting to a counteroffensive posture, timing his moves to exploit the visible weakening of German momentum. Civilian suffering reached a climax during these days. The Hungarian countryside, already devastated by weeks of fighting, was further ravaged as villages changed hands or were razed by artillery. Refugee columns, composed of both Hungarian civilians and German evacuees, clogged roads targeted by Soviet aircraft, while others were forced to scatter into forests or fields to avoid capture or requisition by either army. Local infrastructure, bridges, railways, and roads, was systematically destroyed, both as a defensive measure by retreating Germans and through Soviet bombardment, leaving the region a shattered wasteland. Food and shelter were scarce, disease spread rapidly among displaced populations, and civilian casualties mounted as indiscriminate shelling and looting became routine. By 17th of March, it was clear to all but the most insulated figures in Berlin that Operation Frühlingserwachen had reached its apex and was already sliding toward failure. The German advance had stalled, its spearheads immobilized by fuel shortages, relentless Soviet counterfire, and the crumbling cohesion of its supporting infantry. Soviet forces, sensing the turning tide, began to prepare a full-scale counteroffensive designed not only to halt the Germans, but to drive them back decisively, ensuring that Hungary and Austria would be firmly within the Red Army's grasp before the war's final campaigns. What had begun as Germany's last great gamble was now poised to transform into another catastrophic retreat. From 18 to 22 of March 1945, the German offensive unraveled under the weight of Soviet resistance, logistical collapse, and the exhaustion of its armored spearheads. With the panzer formations of the 6th SS Panzer Army no longer capable of sustained operations, the German High Command found itself in a reactive posture, attempting to hold shrinking salients against an increasingly assertive Red Army. Soviet counterattacks, initially probing and localized, grew in intensity and coordination, aimed not only at halting the German advance, but at exploiting exposed flanks and recapturing lost ground. The initiative had passed decisively to the Soviets, and the Germans, deprived of fuel, artillery shells, and reinforcements, were forced into a reluctant defensive across the entire Lake Balaton sector. German resistance during this phase was marked by improvisation and scattered acts of tactical ingenuity. but it could not compensate for the overwhelming Soviet advantages in manpower and logistics. On the southern flank, Soviet units launched counterattacks against the positions held by the German 2nd Panzer and 6th Armies, recapturing key road junctions and severing communications between advancing German units. In the center, Soviet Guards divisions mounted coordinated infantry and tank assaults against overstretched Waffen-SS positions, steadily forcing the attackers back toward their original lines. German attempts to plug these breaches were hampered by lack of reserves. Formations often had to be repositioned under fire, while supply convoys were targeted relentlessly by Soviet air power. To cope with the changing situation, German field commanders began adopting flexible tactics, including limited counterattacks, tactical withdrawals, and the use of immobile tanks as makeshift artillery. Panther and Tiger tanks, once the spearhead of the assault, were increasingly deployed from static positions, dug into hillsides or behind rubble to ambush advancing Soviet armor. Infantry units, particularly those from elite Waffen-SS divisions, formed ad hoc battle groups, capable of temporary resistance but incapable of holding ground for long. Rearguard actions slowed Soviet advances in some areas, but at the cost of high casualties and the loss of equipment that could not be replaced or recovered. Commanders at the regimental and divisional levels operated with growing autonomy, often defying higher orders in order to preserve their units or conduct local withdrawals in defiance of Hitler's directives. The Red Army, meanwhile, adapted quickly to the shifting dynamic. Recognizing that the German offensive had reached its limit, Soviet commanders transitioned to an aggressive defense, aiming not just to repulse German attacks, but to bleed their formations and prepare the battlefield for a decisive counterstroke. Artillery fire grew heavier and more coordinated, especially in sectors where German forces were attempting to hold recently captured positions. Soviet engineers mined retreat routes and reinforced defensive lines with anti-tank ditches and camouflage gun emplacements, anticipating German fallback efforts. Air support intensified, with Soviet aircraft flying hundreds of sorties daily, bombing suspected supply depots, rear command posts, and even individual tanks caught in open terrain. The psychological strain on German troops reached its peak during these days. Morale plummeted as the realization set in that the offensive had failed and that Soviet forces were preparing to counterattack in force. Letters and reports from the front describe soldiers sleeping in wet, frozen foxholes, going days without warm meals or rest, and watching helplessly as their vehicles ran out of fuel and were abandoned or destroyed. Units operated under constant pressure, knowing that requests for relief or withdrawal would likely be denied or ignored by higher command. In some sectors, cohesion broke down entirely, with Volkssturm units deserting or surrendering, and SS formations refusing to take orders from Wehrmacht officers. Disputes between branches of the armed forces, already a feature of the Nazi command structure, became more pronounced under stress, further undermining operational unity. Soviet troops also bore the mental and physical toll of the battle. Many divisions had suffered heavy casualties during the initial German assault, and though reinforcements were available, they often arrived under fire or were thrown into battle with little time to acclimate. Still, the knowledge that they had stopped the last major German counteroffensive and that Berlin was now within strategic reach boosted Soviet morale considerably. Political officers and commanders emphasized the historical importance of the moment, rallying troops for the coming counteroffensive by linking their efforts to the final destruction of fascism. By 22nd of March, the German lines were under continuous pressure, and a general withdrawal was already in progress, albeit unofficial and often uncoordinated. Sepp Dietrich, acknowledging the futility of further attacks, began pulling elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army back toward prepared positions near the original front line, hoping to preserve his remaining armor for a defensive stand. Hitler, enraged by the failure, blamed his commanders for cowardice and sabotage and ordered units to hold ground or face court-martial, but his commands were increasingly disregarded. The last phase of Operation Frühlingserwachen had begun, not with a breakthrough, but with a slow collapse masked by determined but doomed resistance. By late March 1945, the final unraveling of Operation Frühlingserwachen was underway as the Red Army initiated its own counteroffensive, turning the battlefield around Lake Balaton into a retreat route for the battered German formations. Soviet forces, now fully mobilized and reinforced, launched a series of coordinated assaults beginning on 23rd March, targeting the exhausted units of the 6th SS Panzer Army and their supporting formations. Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front, aided by Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front to the north, pressed forward with overwhelming infantry strength, massed armor, and concentrated artillery fire, seeking not just to recover lost ground, but to encircle and destroy retreating German units before they could reach defensible positions farther west. The shift from defense to offense was deliberate and methodical, designed to capitalize on the Germans' logistical paralysis and fractured morale. German resistance at this stage was fragmented and increasingly desperate. Many panzer divisions, crippled by fuel shortages, could only fight as static strongpoints, with their remaining tanks dug in as immobile defensive weapons. Others, attempting to retreat, were forced to abandon vehicles and heavy equipment to keep pace with the footbound infantry and avoid encirclement. Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, once envisioned as the vanguard of Germany's last great counterattack, was reduced to a patchwork of depleted battle groups, each operating with minimal coordination. Attempts to mount local counterattacks, often using small clusters of armored vehicles or hastily gathered infantry, rarely achieved more than temporary delays, as Soviet artillery and air power overwhelmed any localized gains. The 6th Army and 3rd Panzer Army, similarly depleted, struggled to hold their sectors as Soviet breakthroughs developed across multiple points of the front. The Soviet advance, though deliberate, inflicted a steady and devastating attrition on German forces. Artillery bombardments preceded every assault, pulverizing German positions and demoralizing the defenders before infantry and tanks moved in. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft patrolled the roads and fields relentlessly, striking at any visible movement and reducing retreating convoys to burning wreckage. Engineers destroyed or seized bridges ahead of the Germans, funneling retreat routes into narrow choke points that became killing grounds for Soviet artillery and airstrikes. Soviet mechanized units, operating with ample fuel and supplies, pushed deep into the German rear, cutting off stragglers and preventing any chance of regrouping for a stable defense. Civilians caught in this phase of the fighting faced unrelenting danger. Refugee columns, already swollen with Hungarian and German families fleeing the front, became entangled with retreating Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations. These masses slowed the German withdrawal, creating targets for Soviet aircraft and artillery. Looting and requisitioning by both sides stripped the countryside bare, while partisan bands, some Soviet-aligned, others acting independently, harassed convoys, further destabilizing the routes westward. For many civilians, survival meant abandoning possessions and moving off the roads entirely, seeking shelter in forests or isolated farmsteads until the tide of armies passed. Within the German command, discord deepened as the retreat accelerated. Field commanders, recognizing the impossibility of halting the Soviet advance, focused on preserving what remained of their units, often defying Hitler's orders to hold ground or counterattack. Communications with Berlin grew strained, with reports from the front increasingly sanitized or delayed to avoid Hitler's wrath. Sepp Dietrich himself, faced with the annihilation of his remaining armor, chose to withdraw against explicit orders, moving his divisions toward Austria to avoid encirclement and destruction. This defiance underscored the collapse of centralized German command authority, as survival, rather than obedience, became the overriding priority for most officers. The Red Army's counteroffensive, while meeting scattered resistance, rolled steadily forward, reclaiming the villages and territory seized during the German advance and pushing beyond them. By the end of March, Soviet spearheads had not only erased the gains of Frühlingserwachen, but had advanced deep into western Hungary, threatening Vienna itself. The German retreat, marked by abandoned equipment, shattered units, and overwhelmed medical columns, reflected the broader disintegration of the Reich's remaining military strength. What had begun as a bold, if desperate, attempt to turn the tide of war had become a headlong withdrawal, with the remnants of Germany's last elite formations reduced to defensive fragments, struggling to escape the tightening grip of the advancing Red Army. By the first days of April 1945, the remnants of Germany's forces from Operation Frühlingserwachen were in full retreat, their shattered formations streaming toward Austria as the Red Army pressed relentlessly forward. The once prized panzer divisions of the 6th SS Panzer Army, which had spearheaded the counterattack, now resembled scattered collections of infantry and immobile tanks. Most of their heavy armor had been abandoned for lack of fuel or destroyed to prevent capture, while the surviving crews joined retreating foot soldiers in disorganized columns. Attempts to establish a coherent defensive line along the Rob and Raba rivers quickly collapsed as Soviet mechanized units bypassed strong points, cutting off stragglers and overrunning hastily prepared positions. What remained of the German 6th Army and 3rd Panzer Army fared no better, with both suffering severe attrition from relentless Soviet artillery and airstrikes that turned retreat corridors into killing zones. The retreat itself was chaotic and marked by scenes of desperation. Thousands of German soldiers, some still armed, others wounded or without weapons, mingled with tens of thousands of Hungarian and German civilians in endless columns. Refugees on carts, bicycles, and foot slowed the withdrawal of combat units, making them vulnerable to constant Soviet harassment. Sturmovik aircraft prowled above the main roads, bombing and strafing anything that moved, while Soviet artillery targeted choke points and bridges to maximize destruction. Abandoned equipment, burning vehicles, and scattered bodies lined the routes westward, evidence of the price exacted by the Red Army's pursuit. Many German soldiers chose to discard their uniforms and attempt escape as civilians, while others sought to break through Soviet lines in small groups, hoping to surrender to Western Allied forces instead of facing Soviet captivity. For the Red Army, the drive westward was relentless but measured. Tolbukin and Malinovsky sought not merely to reclaim the ground lost during the German counteroffensive, but to exploit the collapse of enemy resistance and secure positions that would ease the coming drive into Austria and southern Germany. Soviet mechanized and cavalry units pushed deep into the Hungarian countryside, targeting German command posts and supply depots while sealing escape routes wherever possible. Artillery operating from captured forward positions bombarded German staging areas and bridgeheads, while Soviet infantry systematically cleared villages and strong points left behind by retreating enemy forces. Although the pace of the advance strained Soviet logistics, fuel convoys often lagged behind the spearheads, and the destruction of infrastructure slowed movement. The Red Army's overwhelming superiority ensured that these delays were temporary rather than decisive. The humanitarian toll grew even starker during this withdrawal. Civilians trapped on the roads were subjected to bombardment, looting, and violence, often with little distinction made between refugees and retreating combatants. Soviet troops, many embittered by years of occupation and atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht, frequently engaged in acts of reprisal, while German authorities requisitioned supplies from the same populations, worsening the suffering of those they claimed to protect. Epidemics spread among displaced groups as medical services collapsed, and with most infrastructure destroyed or abandoned, hunger and exposure claimed thousands before they could reach safer areas. In this environment, partisan groups, some supporting the Soviets, others simply exploiting the chaos, raided columns and scavenged from both armies, adding another layer of fear and instability to the retreat. Within the German command, the disintegration of operational authority became undeniable. Reports from field officers described entire battalions fragmenting into small groups, some surrendering outright, others heading west in hopes of evading both Soviet capture and the wrath of their superiors. Hitler, enraged by the failure of the offensive, accused Sepp Dietrich and his SS divisions of betrayal, going so far as to strip the Leibstandarte of its honorary cuff titles in a symbolic act of punishment. Yet such gestures did little to change the reality on the ground. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS in Hungary were no longer capable of meaningful resistance as cohesive armies. Even as Hitler demanded counterattacks and the holding of Vienna at all costs, commanders on the ground shifted their priorities entirely to survival, focusing on delaying actions only long enough to withdraw the remnants of their forces toward the Austrian frontier. By the first week of April, the battle for Hungary had effectively ended as a German offensive operation and transformed entirely into a Soviet advance. The Red Army, though still facing pockets of resistance, secured the Lake Balaton region and pushed rapidly toward Vienna, while the last remnants of Germany's elite formations retreated in disorder. Operation Frühlingserwachen, conceived as a bold strike to secure vital oil fields and delay the Soviet advance, had instead bled Germany's last reserves of fuel, armor, and manpower. The failure not only accelerated the collapse of the Southern Front, but left Austria and the approaches to Bavaria exposed, ensuring that the war's final battles would be fought on German soil with forces that were no longer capable of sustained defense. Operation Frühlingserwachen, conceived as Germany's final large-scale counteroffensive of the Second World War, left a legacy of futility and devastation far greater than any lasting strategic effect. Launched with the intention of safeguarding Hungary's vital oil fields and delaying the Soviet advance into Austria and southern Germany, it instead depleted the last reserves of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS at a moment when the Reich could least afford such losses. The failure of the operation sealed the fate of Germany's southern front, accelerating the Red Army's drive toward Vienna and ensuring that by mid-April 1945, the war would shift irrevocably into German territory. In just over 3 weeks of combat, Germany's most elite armored divisions, including remnants of the Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend, were reduced to shadows of their former strength. Thousands of irreplaceable tanks, vehicles, and heavy weapons were abandoned or destroyed, not by decisive Soviet attacks alone, but by fuel starvation and the impossibility of sustaining mobile warfare under relentless pressure. The immediate consequences of the operation were stark. The Red Army, having blunted and reversed the German thrust, secured Hungary and swiftly advanced to capture Vienna by 13th of April, effectively removing one of the last economic and logistical footholds the Reich possessed outside its own borders. German forces, retreating in disarray, carried the scars of the failed offensive into Austria, where they would face encirclement and destruction in the final battles of the war. The civilian toll was equally devastating. Hungarian villages around Lake Balaton lay in ruins, their populations scattered by shellfire, looting, and forced evacuations. Tens of thousands of refugees, Hungarian, German, and other displaced persons, continued their desperate westward flight, many never reaching safety as disease, hunger, and indiscriminate violence claimed countless lives. Historically, Operation Frühlingserwachen has been viewed as a symbol of the Nazi regime's strategic delusion in its dying months. Military historians often cite the offensive as a case study in how political desperation overrode sound operational planning. Hitler's fixation on the Nagikaniza oil fields, while economically understandable, ignored the operational realities. Germany no longer had the logistical capacity, manpower, or air cover to sustain such an ambitious thrust. The insistence on pressing forward despite collapsing fuel supplies and mounting casualties ensured that the operation not only failed, but left the Wehrmacht in a weaker position than if it had remained on the defensive. Sepp Dietrich and his subordinates, despite their tactical skill and the resilience of their troops, could not overcome the systemic shortages and the Soviets' overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. In the broader scope of the war, the failure of Frühlingserwachen erased any lingering illusion that Germany could meaningfully alter the course of the conflict. While the Ardennes offensive had already signaled the end of Germany's strategic options in the West, the collapse of the Lake Balaton operation marked the definitive loss of initiative on the Eastern Front. With Hungary secured and the German forces in the region shattered, the Red Army's path into Austria and southern Germany was largely unobstructed. Within weeks, Soviet forces would link up with Western allies deeper inside the collapsing Reich, dividing what remained of German defenses and hastening the war's conclusion. The operation, far from buying time or creating opportunities for negotiation, shortened the timeline of Germany's defeat by burning through its last viable armored formations. The memory and commemoration of Operation Frühlingserwachen reflect its dual legacy as both a testament to German military desperation and a prelude to the end of the war in Europe. In post-war narratives, particularly within the Soviet Union, the operation was celebrated as yet another failed attempt by fascist forces to resist the inevitable triumph of the Red Army, often portrayed as proof of Soviet resilience and superior planning. In Western and later academic histories, it is more often depicted as a cautionary tale of strategic overreach, illustrating how Germany's leadership, blinded by ideology and denial, squandered its remaining resources in a campaign that could not succeed. Today, memorials in Hungary mark the sites of the fiercest fighting, though with a focus on the human cost rather than triumphalist narratives. As a final act of offensive warfare by the Third Reich, Operation Frühlingserwachen encapsulated the contradictions of Germany's final months. Tactical brilliance among its remaining field commanders undone by the strategic folly of a regime unwilling to recognize reality. It left the Wehrmacht gutted, Hungary devastated, and the Red Army poised to drive into the heart of Central Europe. In the chronology of the Second World War, it stands less as a battle that could have turned the tide and more as a somber prelude to the inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany, a final, costly gesture that hastened the very outcome it sought to delay.